Good evening, everyone. Warm welcome to Overseas Press Club members, supporters of PEN, China Hands, and others in the audience who are interested in press freedom and writers' freedom. I'm Minky Worden. I'm on the board of the Overseas Press Club. I'm a dedicated supporter of PEN, and I work as my day job at Human Rights Watch. And I also lived and worked in Hong Kong, so I have a strong interest in the report that we're going to present tonight. I wanted to say a few words first, if I may, about the work of the Overseas Press Club. For those of you who don't know the organization, we've been around for more than 75 years. We are dedicated to defending foreign correspondents around the world, to expanding their work and to honoring their work. We also have a foundation that provides scholarships for recent journalism grads to become foreign correspondents, to move to Beijing or Hanoi or Bukavu to learn the craft and to spend a career as a foreign correspondent. The organization PEN has done extraordinary work on press freedom around the world. The organization did a fantastic report in January of 2015 called Threatened Harbor about press freedom and the threats to publishing in about press freedom and the threats to publishing in Hong Kong. That report that PEN put out was actually well in advance of the 5 publishers who were abducted, including from Hong Kong last year in 2015. So I think we're discussing the topic at a very important time. This is the report, darkened screen. I hope everyone's got a copy of it. I'm going to first introduce Suzanne Nossel to walk you through the findings of this report. You should read an outstanding story in the New York Times business section today about the report by Ian Johnson that goes through the findings of it. But we're very fortunate to have Suzanne Nossel with us today. She's the executive director of PEN and is a great defender of press freedom and the freedom of to write. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Minky. Minky is a great friend to PEN and a great friend to China and to Hong Kong and a great friend to me. So extremely grateful to be here with her tonight and with our distinguished panel. This report really grew out of a trip that we made to China in the beginning of 2015 with a couple of different PEN writers, including Art Spiegelman and Susan Orlean, and we had meetings with all kinds of different groups, authors, dissidents, lawyers, and we also met with foreign journalists, including Gady and Ed when they were there. And as PEN, we've always worked on many cases of Chinese writers who are under pressure or in jail. Liu Xiaobo is the president of the Independent Chinese PEN Center, was members of PEN and leaders of PEN who were at the forefront of the call for him to win the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize. And so China's always been very close to PEN's heart, and we still remain very much focused on the situation of Chinese writers and the repression that they face, but we recognize that there was another story that needed to be told, and it's centered around the critical role that foreign journalists play in providing an essential window into China. And it's a window that informs diplomacy, trade, corporate engagement, cultural engagement, educational engagement. And it's really the way so many of us know so much of what we know about China is thanks to dedicated, intrepid journalists who have gone and ferreted out the stories. And as China's become so much more important on the world stage, their work has become increasingly essential. And what we learned was that they are facing greater and greater pressures, particularly under Xi Jinping. And we wanted to document that and draw attention to the ways in which their space to operate is being constricted and the risk that that poses for the information that all of us rely upon to make such crucial decisions when it comes to engagement with China. And so we worked with a researcher. We interviewed more than 36 journalists who worked in China, and we document in the report a whole series of forms of pressure and pressure tactics that the Chinese government is applying. One that's received a lot of attention is around visa denials and the arbitrary refusal to renew visas, delays in visa approvals, retaliatory unwillingness to renew visas for journalists who've taken on some of the most hard-hitting and sensitive stories, but also more direct and menacing tactics, including harassment of journalists and their families, direct threats made to journalists sitting in rooms with Chinese officials and being told, what to write about and what not to write about. Discussions about which media outlets and which journalists are considered exemplary because they follow the rules. They've been willing to pull back on certain stories, and the Chinese government now expects that from others. We talk about also the really dangerous harassment faced by news assistants, so the Chinese nationals who work with foreign journalists, who provide them with the essential service of sometimes language, but also local knowledge, connections, the ability to set up meetings and interviews so that they can carry out their work. Those individuals can be most at risk because they're Chinese nationals, and the sense of caution that the Chinese government may have in relation to Western journalists whose fates get a lot of attention and who are employees of major foreign media companies. That's not necessarily the case with news assistants, and we talk in particular about one really egregious case of detention and disappearance of a news assistant and tactics that may amount to torture, sleep deprivation, hooding. So that too has a chilling effect on the ability of journalists to feel like they can work with news assistants and ensure their security as that work is carried out. We also talk about the narrowing range of topics that the Chinese government is going to allow foreign journalists to probe into. Xi Jinping's image has become very sensitive. Corruption has become incredibly sensitive. The government is also withdrawing types of information that used to be more readily accessible. They're putting in pressure on sources that have talked to journalists in the past, but now feel that doing so would incur great risk to them. And then finally, we talk about Western media companies and how they're responding to this. And there have been reports in the media that I'm sure many of you are familiar with about what happened with Bloomberg after they did a series of hard-hitting exposés, and they were directly threatened in terms of the fate of their terminal business in China, which is the very lucrative and much larger portion of their business, and very open statements that their leadership made about restricting the scope of their coverage to focus on business issues and to avoid hard-hitting exposés. And what we found was, while it's not that widespread, there are other worrisome trends in terms of how media outlets are drawing the parameters of their coverage and what they will and won't authorize their journalists to look into. And that can be a very sort of neutral seeming way to avoid controversy, but what it means is that certain topics really become out of bounds and off limits. We also talk about Reuters in particular having adopted, according to several sources that we spoke to, a new protocol whereby their stories to do with certain sensitive topics are subject to additional layers of review. And there's a special process that they've adopted, we've been told, where those stories are really heavily scrutinized, and the result has been fewer stories on sensitive topics like human rights issues. We also took a look at one kind of additional service that foreign journalists in China play is being a lifeline to the Chinese citizenry. With Chinese domestic media so heavily constricted, even though Many of the websites of foreign media outlets are difficult to access. It may require going through a firewall. Many of those websites are blocked. Still, this information does get through in some cases, and it provides an important outside perspective. And what we found taking a look at the Chinese language media, the Chinese language websites of different media outlets, was that in some cases there seemed to be a pretty clear pattern of the most hard-hitting and sensitive stories that were being published globally not being translated into Chinese, so that the Chinese population never gets to see those stories. A final note I'll add is that this is these measures are accompanied by kind of a softer, maybe harder to document, but still perceptible if you read through the report, effort by the Chinese government to cast the foreign media as an agent of the West, perhaps of the United States government, coming to China with an agenda to cast a certain light on that country. And I think that effort to portray the foreign media in that light has had some effect in terms of discrediting the foreign media as a source of information for the Chinese citizenry. And it's another piece of the puzzle in terms of how the Xi Jinping's government is trying to push back against and constrict the role and the influence of foreign media. So that's a quick overview, but really this panel knows much more about these topics than I do. So I am delighted to turn the conversation over to you.
So thank you, Suzanne. I can't think of a more timely moment for this report. One reason is that, as most people in this room know, in September, the southern Chinese city or village of Wuhan once again was in the news. It's a village that became known as sort of a hotbed of democracy and protest, but most interestingly, because the protesters appeared briefly to have won their struggle against corrupt officials, and that's something that doesn't often happen in China. So the city became was able to hold elections and had other reforms as a direct result of protests. It was an interesting study for how the Chinese government was going to manage public protests. However, in September, there were a number of arrests and the protests returned to the village as part of an extensive crackdown. The village chief was arrested and coverage was clamped down on, including 5 reporters from Hong Kong who were arrested and chucked out. But there was also, for the first time in my memory, a bounty given for foreign reporters of $3,000. So even in the post-'89 period, the most extreme crackdown, I don't think we ever saw bounties for foreign reporters. I'm going to ask our panel to comment on the current environment for press freedom in China. We're going to, in the course of the evening, cover social media, business, and many of the topics that that PEN includes in its report. But I'd like to begin with a fundamental question, which is, why does the Chinese government care what foreign reporters write? And I'm going to start with Barbara. Barbara Demick, longtime Los Angeles Times correspondent, great bureau chief in Seoul, Beijing, and author of a number of books.
Thank you very much. Am I on here? Thank you very much, Minky, Suzanne. Well, of course they care. They are, obsessed beyond any reasonable degree about what the outside world thinks of them. There's a saving face phenomenon that is kind of a cliche about China, but it's always surprising how far they go to try to deceive us and to form an impression that's sometimes not true, and often in ways that are very clunky. The press operation is not very sophisticated, and as I think we have a lot of journalists here. If you go into a village and you're reporting, and the town mayor says, sit down, I'll tell you we have these problems and these problems, you come out impressed. When the propaganda chief says everything is perfect, you're not. And the press operation is still very clunky. I think they often do not understand the foreign press in their efforts to shape the news, and it's always very contrarian. And, we certainly found, even covering the Olympics, if we tried to do a story on the table tennis team and young table tennis players, we had so much trouble getting permission that we thought, oh, let's go talk about the petitioners instead, because it was easier to do.
So that's I think a theme that has surfaced also, is that the Chinese government's effort to get good press coverage often backfires. Yeah. The New York Times had longtime New York Times correspondent in China, I think since before the Beijing Olympics in 2008. Now based in Beijing, and also doing social media from Beijing. A Facebook Live, I watched your Facebook Live presentation. Talk to us about the Times strategy. You have also done something that has been hard for others to achieve. You opened a Chinese language website that has been blocked like many other news websites. Talk to us about, do you think the Chinese government cares about foreign media coverage, and if so, why?
They do, and I think Barbara hit on a good point, which is obviously what they care to a degree about the image that they present to the outside world, but I also think that they see there being increasing amount of information that flows from the foreign media to the people within China, and they want to control the information that people within China are getting, especially as news organizations open up more Chinese language products or websites or apps or whatever. And also, I think starting in around 2012, there was a lot of reporting on elite politics throughout the year that began overseas, whether it was with Western media organizations or overseas Chinese organizations based in the West. And I think that a lot of that information filtered back to China, and it put them on guard for the type of impact or influence that information could have on the domestic readers. So I think that they're very wary of that, and obviously part of their growing efforts to control that are blocking websites. And I think we've seen a lot of blocks of websites in the last 2 years, 2 to 3 years. It's not just the New York Times. It's we've seen the Wall Street Journal has been blocked and continues to be blocked. Reuters, other organizations like that. So I think organizations that do open up Chinese websites face the conundrum of the fact that, in theory, those websites are supposed to generate revenue for these organizations based on advertisement in the Chinese readers, and which means getting the Chinese market up to a certain level for these products. But then the Chinese government knows that there's, one, they want to block them to prevent news from trickling out, but also they know that this is a point of leverage that they have over these media organizations. So I think all the organizations, including Times, who have these types of websites or products are trying to navigate that, and it's very tricky.
Yeah, I want to just kind of jump on that as well, because I think they basically raised two separate threads. There is the saving face issue, which has been there for years, and when you put Hu Jintao on the cover 10 years ago with his eyes being put out, like Forbes did, you get banned. When you put him on the cover after the stock market crash, as the Economist and Time magazine did, you also get banned. And that has been pretty consistent. They respond to that aggressively. But the new twist is the new problem in the space is that this information spreads so easily within the Chinese public. There's social media. There's an ability for something to spread virally before it gets blocked. Instantaneously. So there's a lot more fear of breaking news by Western organizations. But even on top of that, I think Western reporters, and I think this really gets at why there's so much increased pressure on foreign reporters, is I think Western reporters are doing a much better job than they've ever done before. They're much more aggressive, much more investigative. This obviously started in 2012 with Bloomberg's story about Xi Jinping's wealth, with the New York Times story about the family wealth of Wen Xiaopao. Sorry, these are family wealth of Xi Jinping as well, not of Xi Jinping personally, I should note. I'm sure I'll hear directly from the government after that. Their websites were immediately banned. Their visas immediately became a problem. And it should be noted this was under Hu Jintao's last year. It wasn't under Xi Jinping. This is a systemic response to much better reporting and much more minute, detailed reporting of top Chinese leaders about elite politics. Some of the stuff was done 10, 15 years ago, but not at this level, not personal finances of leaders. Reporting on elite politics, for instance, this is in the report, the last time an assistant was jailed before this recent period was when the New York Times broke a story about that Jiang Zemin was going to do something with the Central Military Commission. This is like in 2003 or 4. And it was about like a general. And Zhao Yan was jailed for, he was the assistant, the New York Times news assistant was jailed for several years. That was a direct response to that kind of aggressive reporting. What's changed now is if you do that kind of report now, it will inevitably filter back into the Chinese public. The stakes are even higher. So I think the response will be even more aggressive. And so I think that's why in the last few years you've seen all of these kind of escalation tactics. I don't think it's a Xi Jinping thing. I think it's a reaction to Western reporters, in particular foreign reporters, doing a much better job, and the fact that much of that is now available in Chinese and can filter back into the Chinese public.
There's a well-known Chinese saying, "Kill the chicken to scare the monkeys." And do you think that, and this is also government strategy, certainly with human rights defenders, lawyers, Tibetans, ethnic minorities, do you think this is something that the Chinese government is applying to Western reporters? Let's make an example of Bloomberg, and everyone else is going to fall in line. It's also a malice tactic, United Front strategy. Barbara, we'll just go down that.
Well, I don't think it would deter the reporters themselves. It deters the companies they work for. I think, frankly, any of us would have been thrilled to do the kind of reporting that Bloomberg and the New York Times did. And I don't think any reporter has been deterred. But yeah, the people who own the companies are, and especially companies that do, that have terminals and other sources of income coming from China.
Right, and on that point, the Chinese government's leverage over news organizations is much higher than it's ever been because of that financial aspect. There's a market in China.
Yeah. But truthfully, of those of us, I mean, we used to joke too, like, what could I write to get kicked out? Because I think a lot of us, maybe stayed longer than we wanted to because they were having a hard time getting fresh visas. So it's like, if I report on this, I can't think of a single case of a reporter who will pull their punches for fear of getting in trouble with the government.
I'm going to divert to Ed to ask one question. There were at one point there were so many New York Times reporters who had visa troubles that the Hong Kong bureau had swelled quite a lot, and that coincided with the umbrella movement protests in Hong Kong, which meant that the Times had a huge number of staff people in Hong Kong to cover the movement when it happened. Do you think of that as a great irony that there were so many journalists waiting for visas to clear in Beijing at the time the Occupy Central movement happened?
I guess you could see it to the degree that it was somewhat of a benefit for news organizations that had a lot of people there, like the Times. But I think that Hong Kong's always been a gathering place for a lot of journalists, and there's large newsrooms and editing hubs there. So the Occupy movement would have been well covered under any circumstances. We just happened to have some extra people there because they were waiting to get into China.
Let me switch the topic a little bit to social media, because that's one of the major, if you look at the last 30 years of coverage in China, and I would like to say that the Overseas Press Club, every year we have a China Hands reunion, we have a Russia Hands reunion, And I think we're proud to count among our members people who have reported and written on China, like Seymour Topping, on Audrey Topping, for literally decades. When you look at certainly the post-89 period, there was, I think we wouldn't have thought of it as a golden age of reporting in the 90s and early thousands before the Olympics. Can you talk to us about what's changed maybe since 2008? I think all of you were there for the Olympics. Why is the environment tightened, and how does that relate, and has it worsened under Xi Jinping?
It has worsened. I think the environment is tightened because the technology has empowered the Chinese people so much more. So you have not only social media, but you also have camera phones, and you can, a riot that gets suppressed in 2005 might just disappear. You never heard about it. Maybe reporters hear rumors about it, even if dozens were killed or something like that. You're not able to prove it. And now that kind of thing happens, and there's going to be some images of it. There's going to be maybe tweets before it gets censored, and you hear a lot more about these things. So that's why there's such increased control of those methods. I mean, social media has been it's transformative of how the Chinese media do their jobs, even under the pressures they're under. And that's been true going back to blogging, when they put up reporters' notes on blogs, from stories that have been changed for publication, and all the way up to today. And those have been useful resources for reporters going back many years, and it's been tightened considerably. Now, for foreign reporters, now we have the benefit of being able to go somewhere, and if there's something happening, we can instantly report on it. There's really nothing to be done about it. And now, of course, we can still publish anyway. We're not censored when we publish our reports. But the fact that we can get that story out, as happened in Wuhan, Malcolm Moore, I remember his tweets that started, that actually drew a lot more reporters down there very quickly. And I think it's interesting that they had such an immediate response to foreign reporters. Now, as our friend Phil Pan tweeted, it would be nice if we could turn ourselves in and get the $3,000 reward. And I think that is it's an ingrained systemic reaction to the fact that we have a lot more tools at our disposal.
Right. And coupled with that technology is their sense of the overall international environment, which is, I think, they starting in the late Hu Jintao era after the Olympics, they started looking at things that were going on overseas, the Green Revolution that summer in Iran, the Arab revolutions, things going on in the former Soviet Union states, and especially Ukraine. And I think that they sense that there was this inchoate conspiracy from the West, like the West in very general terms, and Western organizations, which included media, included government, included NGOs, and that they were pushing or aiding these sort of domestic indigenous revolutions that were taking place around the world that were seeking to overthrow regimes. I think that they do think that they've studied the fall of the Soviet Union, and they've looked at sort of how the Communist Party in the Soviet Union weakened. Xi Jinping has famously talked about that behind closed doors and said that no one's man enough to stand up when the Soviet Union fell. And so I think that that's coupled with their sense of that there's this technological way that allows information to spread very quickly. And so they see the Western media as part of this sort of like shadowy force out there, and they talk about it. If you talk to a lot of Chinese associates, they'll mention it, especially people within the system, they'll mention this. And it's always hard to tell whether people might be saying it's part of like a propaganda thing or whether they internalized it. And I think to a certain degree, a lot of people have internalized it, people in the system.
Since you mentioned the context of how the world deals with Xi Jinping, I'm going to ask Suzanne a question. Last fall, when Xi Jinping came to Washington, the red carpet was rolled out in Washington, the UK, you wrote a very strong op-ed in the Los Angeles Times calling for leaders who were seeing him to mention Liu Xiaobo and Ilham Tohti. and other peaceful critics who have gotten long and unjust prison terms. Do you see do you see any leaders taking you up on your recommendation? Is there any hope of world leaders getting a backbone to stand up to this type of thuggery?
I think it's in some ways sort of a disappointing picture in that I think many foreign leaders, I think our own president at moments has kind of come to feel that this relationship between Washington and Beijing is so complex, so interdependent, so multifaceted, that they're, to introduce what they know are the most sensitive and the most, the things that sort of strike most negative chord in the context of the bilateral relationship, the sourest notes. I think very often sort of the China hands, even if they're, those around the president, his advisors, maybe even himself, as sympathetic as they are, and as willing as they are in Washington to, have an event or host dissidents, as welcoming as they are, the idea of sort of casting this sour note in the bilateral relationship is something that they're very reluctant to do. I mean, I think we saw in a sense over how the president handled the snafu around his arrival on the tarmac in Beijing, and he sort of, brushed it off his shoulder is his way, but he just doesn't want to draw attention to or, put a fine point on these difficult tensions in the relationship. And I think human rights is increasingly sort of seen in that light. And I think the other side of it is a genuine question over, that they have over what can be accomplished. And I think many around the president would argue that nothing will be achieved by raising it. You'll only get their backs up. They'll only bristle, they'll become even more withholding of information. They will, precisely reject any action that might be seen as responding or capitulating to that form of pressure. I think one of the downsides of that is, a real risk that I think the United States in particular has always been seen as a lifeline to Chinese dissidents. I mean, we all remember when Chen Guangcheng came to the U.S. Embassy in Beijing seeking refuge and sort of did so saying that, he saw the United States as a place where, you would flee and you could flee. And I think, that role that we have played for him and many others is very central to the U.S.'s identity and a big source of strength. So I do see that as at risk.
So we have a more confident and muscular China internationally in the South China Sea, country that's projecting strength abroad, and also projecting strength abroad through media. One of the trends that Penn identifies in the report as something to watch is the large number of Chinese state-run media that are proliferating around the world, Confucius Institutes for the media around the world. Can you all talk about the role of, say, the Global Times, which is now producing editorials in the voice of the Chinese Communist Party? Is it having an effect? Is it working?
We all, as reporters in Beijing, we all love the Global Times because they said a lot of wacky things, and they, gave us something to quote, and it was sort of, they were a little bit like, the Donald Trump voice. This is like it was like this crazy ultra-nationalist, and it was always, if you were lazy, you could always get a good quote from them. I think, not that any of us
on deadline, right?
Not that any of us were crazy. I mean, I think what is a little bit scarier is, mainland funded news organizations buying media in Hong Kong and Taiwan. That I find really much more chilling, because I don't see Xinhua or the Confucius Institutes really having that much influence on mainstream coverage. But, when they started investing in Hong Kong media, that's pretty scary.
Yeah, you've seen the South China Morning Post Chinese website covered. I think that's an interesting byproduct of the purchase by by Jack Ma. I do think the overseas English language or foreign language reporting by state media, Chinese state media, probably has some effect on the margins, and it becomes maybe the default copy in kind of newspapers in developing world countries. Certainly in Africa, they've got a pretty good foothold, and I could easily see it in other places where news organizations don't have much money. They can take this English language wire about whatever it is. It could be the G20 or some other meeting, and it could seem like it's pretty innocuous just to take this wire copy. But of course, the rules of engagement for those reporters is different from the copy that we produce. So it's a little. I can see that as being worrisome, kind of a creeping effect.
Right. I think also there's another effect on the margins that Gady raises, which is in the U.S. I've seen a lot of sort of Chinese friends or even family members watching CCTV, for example, in the U.S. to get the news, and I think you'll see a lot of, as there's a lot of immigrants in the U.S., whether you go back decades or even more recent, a few years back, and before they might have gotten their news from something like World Journal newspaper or Singtao Daily, and now CCTV there are other Chinese language alternatives in the U.S. and in other countries, and so the point of view of sort of the party and the government is more represented in these countries for Chinese viewers and readers.
When Bill Clinton went to China in 1998, he famously said that the Chinese government was not going to be able to censor the internet. And his quote on that in a speech that he made was that it would be like trying to make Jell-O stick to the wall. I think it's fair to say the Chinese government has made Jell-O stick to the wall. And talk for a minute about the cat and mouse game of censors in China and how that works in the news ecosystem. A piece of news surfaces. How does the Chinese censorship system work for people who are with us tonight or watching?
Well, it's become increasingly sophisticated over time. So from the beginning, even before the Great Firewall existed, there was kind of a blanket blocking of certain foreign websites. They were very conscious from even the day they plugged into the internet that they needed to be able to control the content coming into China, and that was on one side, and then the content being produced within China by at that time not by individuals so much as by media organizations. So they've gotten increasingly sophisticated developing tools to monitor both of those, and as social media evolved and blogging, self-censorship within within social media companies, with party cells inside Chinese internet companies, and in terms of when a tweet gets blocked, let's say, that has valuable news in it or interesting controversial news in it, I think first of all there's automated filtering, so a lot of stuff gets blocked immediately. But if it's something that's a little bit more difficult, there are ways around. There's ways around automated filtering. Let's say there's an image of something that's kind of hard to block automatically. It's quite easy to check what's going viral and to pick off things as they gain velocity, basically, in audience. So I think there's quite a bit of stuff out there on the Chinese internet that no one reads that's controversial that might still be up there. But if it's actually getting any velocity and getting an audience, it will get blocked or it'll get taken down. And so that's sort of how it works domestically. And then with the Great Firewall has become much more fine-tuned, sophisticated over time. Even as they just completely blocked some websites, they're very good at just blocking kind of an individual story and it being quite a quiet thing that doesn't make a headline, as opposed to just blocking a whole news organization. So that's a very quick assessment of that. They can add from their own experience. Obviously, New York Times has dealt with more aggressive blocking.
Right. I think what Gady was saying about the firewall, like we've seen that there are attacks on VPNs. I think almost anyone who lives or works in China knows that VPNs are not reliable at all anymore these days. And so, like, you're dealing with both the internet problems and the pollution. Like, it's commonly said that the pollution and internet problems are probably the two worst things about living in China. And I think most people in this room would agree with that. So the also, I think that there's another. This goes less to the idea of social media and censorship, and it goes to a different thing, which is hacking, and it's mentioned in the report, which is I think that major news organizations have seen many more attempts at hacking into their networks, into emails, and this is consistent with the rise in hacking that you've seen in other industries coming from suspected Chinese hackers. So the Times, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, they've all had hacking attempts, not only on emails of particular correspondents, but on their main networks that are housed in servers in the US, for example. So you have that, that's a new thing that only was detected a few years ago. And then I know that in Beijing, our internet service provider says they've had security officers come and ask to put devices on wires to sort of try and, or on network infrastructure to try and monitor our traffic.
I wanted to add too that although they are very sophisticated and constantly evolving, they can be kind of caught off guard and be behind the curve and then catch up quickly. I mean, I would say a prime example is in 2011 with the train crash in southern China, in southeastern China, that they were, I think, shocked by how that turned into a huge public relations nightmare within China for them because of
Wildfire.
Because of Weibo. I know that right after that, there were meetings at the major social media companies at Sina, where they made it quite clear to the leadership that if you don't step up your internal monitoring and censorship, you guys will just get shut down. And there were, after that, there were these kind of things like a three-day shutdown as a punishment for some other, some other violation that they perceived to be not monitoring themselves well enough. And then another example that was, shoot, I'm just going to forget this, but there was another case where they stepped up. You know what? Keep talking, and I'll come back to it in a second.
Car accident. It was like the son of a.
Yeah, there was that. There was there was the coup
My
attempt.
father is.
There was the coup attempt, and the attempt to go after the whatever coup attempt, the rumors, and the attempt, and then the arrest of detentions of people who spread the rumor. And I'll stop.
Until you remember, I'll just say it's. I wouldn't say I feel sorry for them, but it's very difficult to be a dictatorship in 2016 and control the media. And it is, they keep on evolving, and everybody else keeps on evolving. A lot of things moved from Weibo into Weixin, WeChat, these little WeChat groups. And I've worked as Ed a lot in the Tibetan areas, and they were really trying to, for example, restrict news of self-immolations. Absolutely impossible. 5 minutes it would get out, and it would go into, after Weibo was blocked, it would go into these little, WeChat chats, and that's how actually a lot of Tibetans get their news, is through WeChat.
My memory.
Okay, all right.
It was about the big V's. So the this was made, an exemplar of this was Han Shi, the big V's on Chinese social media. People with
Explain big V's.
Yeah, there are people who are V's for verified. They're verified users, but they have huge followings. Tens of millions of followers on Chinese social media accounts. Han Shi was one of these guys, the CEO of Soho China, the founder of Soho China. And he's the one who popularized, speaking of pollution, combining pollution and the internet here, he is the one who popularized the term PM 2.5 within the Chinese discussion, in the Chinese public sphere. He started tweeting on Weibo the pollution index of the Beijing embassy's air monitor. This raised awareness of PM 2.5. It became an issue that forced the government to be more responsive. And I would say it was a success story, actually, in kind of adaptive authoritarianism, because it was a window where the Chinese government did allow this sort of the awareness to be raised. Maybe somewhat to their regret, but they did respond to something that was there, that was the public sentiment that was there. Now that would be much more difficult, and they have really cracked down on big V's, including Han Shi, making them go on camera and say, they want to be responsible public participants in these forums, and now you do not see these figures spreading, big news of big incidents or rumors or whatever the Chinese government doesn't want them to spread. You're not seeing it. And since then, Weibo has essentially been cleaned up quite a bit. It's become more boring.
I think the window closed, actually.
Yep.
So I think time to go to the room. When you stand up to ask a question, please identify yourself if you don't mind. And we're going to go up here, Elliot.
Yeah, I'm Elliot Sperling. I deal with Tibet and China, formerly of Indiana University. And I would just like to ask the panelists for their reaction. Periodically, this idea surfaces. Most recently, I think when the Gautier was expelled, people bring up the idea, why do Western governments not retaliate and block Xinhua reporters? Especially some people mention the fact that some of the Xinhua centers actually include people who are not really reporters. So I'd just like to ask panelists for their reaction.
This is a good question. There was a very high level, off the record conference on this in the Council on Foreign Relations that I attended, but worked for all. Actually, we're being televised, but it was everybody was saying, everybody was saying, yeah, some of these people are not real reporters. I don't know why we don't do it. There's such a sort of an innate aversion to blocking other press.
Supposedly the United Nations Xinhua Bureau is notorious for this, but I don't know if if the U.S. government, for instance, really can block that.
It was very interesting. I don't know, you were there.
Yeah, I was, yeah.
Because there were, people from sort of, free press advocacy types saying, throw the suckers out.
Well, I haven't seen that from all the free press advocacy types. I'd be interested to see which ones. The State Department's position has generally been that they don't want to basically set a standard that's different from what they expect of everybody else around the world. So they won't block visas for Xinhua reporters. One response, I think Ed is in agreement with me on this, because the New York Times, of course, has had to think about this deeply when they had years of visa issues. But you could do things like slow walking visas for executives, people who really want to come to the U.S. on visits, who are high-powered news executives, who are really government officials, senior government officials. You could do things like that.
Student visas for
Congress
the children.
Congress kids.
Yeah, that's another one. I mean, you can do things like that without publicizing it, and the Chinese government gets the message. In theory, I'm not aware that that's a strategy being pursued. I think that's been something that's been brought up to State Department people in the past, and it's been basically shot down.
Right, but what's interesting is that American officials have said that if they do execute such a strategy, they would never let us know or never let it out in public, so we would never know whether it's actually happening.
But I did, at a previous panel event that the Overseas Press Club had with Joe Kahn and other veteran China editors and reporters, Joe did also point out that there's a discomfort among a lot of press freedom groups and media organizations in asking the U.S. government to do that. That it's not the correct role for press freedom organizations.
Yeah, I remember speaking to the Committee to Protect Journalists. I just don't want to identify the wrong one, but I'm fairly sure they still are of that view, and I was rather unpopular for. It is still. Yeah. Right. And I sort of advocated the opposite view, and I wasn't a popular person in the room.
Within China, there's been an evolving view among officers at the Foreign Correspondents Club of China, based in Beijing, that I think a few years, like 4 or 5 years ago, that some senior officers there were of the view that there should be no sort of retaliatory measures taken by governments in terms of visas. And I think that's evolved over time, just because there's a realization among them that there's no other leverage that you would really have in terms of trying to push China to back away from their hardline stance on using visas to try and get organizations to self-censor.
Well, let's take another question in the back, and I will go to Bob Dietz from the Committee to Tech Journalists. Asia Director.
Concern, CPJ's concern, I'm no longer with CPJ, I'm the guy working with it.
Bob, hang on for the microphone if you want.
I think the real concern, there were several concerns. One is it's really a violation of press freedom rights. If you start expelling journalists for whatever reason, you set a real precedent. The United States or Western countries are supposed to be such bastions of democracy and free speech. It really undercuts that position. There were several others. It could really institute a real tit for tat response, that you kick ours out, we'll kick yours out, back and forth, and you get into a real slinging match. And I think even the bigger concern at this point is that in that secret meeting, which no one was allowed to report, Barbara, there was a realization that if you start even at the higher levels of government officials and Xinhua officials and those not just the working journalists, what you do is you bring down a real retaliation on the reporters in China, foreign reporters in China, and you will see that no matter what level you take it to. But I think the underlying position I speak for CPJ, but I think I speak for other groups too, is that seeking retaliation on reporters is just really a bad example, a bad tactic, and something that most likely won't be effective anyway.
I mean, just to say that's essentially the position that Penn took when we looked at this, when the issue came up after our trip last year. I think the other thing, the situation is improved, at least for the moment, and Vice President Biden raising this at the highest levels, I think made some difference. Imperfect and, sort of vulnerable gains, certainly, but some improvement, and maybe that's another tactic that, force them through.
Let's take a couple of questions at once for the panel. Yes, in the back.
Albert Golson, I'm a member of the Overseas Press Club. The Chinese government over the past several decades has encouraged their young people to obtain Western educations in the United States and in Europe, and there are hundreds of thousands of those students who have studied in democracies and have returned to China. How does this go with the Chinese government, this efforts of censorship, when you have so many hundreds of students returning to China, having a very different perspective of Western media and how to interpret how the Chinese government is trying to block, news coming in?
Let's see, can we take one more question over here in the corner?
I'm Minky Worden. I'm an OPC member and write for Columbia Journalism Review. And I wonder, you mentioned the closing of the Chinese language site of the South China Morning Post. And I just wonder what concerns that raises, especially given Jack Ma's ties to the government, with private business kind of entering into the media space and shutting down the site that reaches a lot of Chinese language readers.
So first question is on effect of so many overseas Chinese students. Are they learning press freedom values or not? And are they bringing it back? And the second question is role of Jack Ma and the nefarious purchase of media.
I'll address the first question briefly. I don't think that there's an easy way to describe the attitudes of young Chinese who come to America or other countries and then go back to China. I think that there's a range of attitudes that they have about Western institutions, whether it's the media or governments or political systems or education systems. I think you see that expressed when you talk to people in China. For example, so we hired a lot of young Chinese into our newsrooms, researchers, and it's a self-selecting group because a lot of them want to practice Western-style journalism, so they come to us and they say they wanted, many of them were educated in the West, and they say they saw how the Western media operated, and they wanted to do that in China, and they didn't want to work for a Chinese news organization because of that. So, but as I said, it's a self-selecting group. We're glad that we have that, but there are also many other people who return to China who feel that China shouldn't have the type of system that the West has, whether it's the system more open media or the political system or whatever other institutions there are here that China's not ready for, or that shouldn't have that, or that China is on the right path and it has its own path. So I think that you see the range of reactions.
I would add to that, and I'll answer the second question in a second, that the subset of people, although it is a very large number of people going overseas, that subset is mostly winners of Chinese society who don't have quite as maybe the long list of grievances that some other segments of Chinese society might be more likely to have. And that, I think, colors the kind of what you see in terms of their experience in the US or elsewhere. And when they go back, I think it's much more resilient to what they experience. They can process, Chinese student overseas can process that the US has a different system in that sense, but still firmly believe that the Chinese system works best for China. And I think you find that attitude quite prevalent, actually. On Hong Kong, or
no, I'm going to disrupt on this. I would just say that there's a number of journalism universities inside China that are teaching Western style journalism, and I find it kind of strange. There's there are two streams of thought in China about what the media should be doing, and there's some really excellent, even in the mainland, journalism education. I spoke last year at the Communications University of China, and I was really impressed with the faculty and the students. They certainly wanted to be real journalists, and they were, being taught at this university. So it kind of, there's two things going on.
Yeah, and I would find that's been true actually for some years, and the life cycle of a young Chinese journalist is to go out there with a lot of ambition and excitement into the Chinese media space, and then to slowly become disillusioned with all the limitations that were placed on you. And I think that's become a shorter cycle of time now under Xi Jinping. On Hong Kong, there's been a progression over many years of kind of a progressively worse environment for the media in Hong Kong. I wrote a story about it a couple of years ago, during Occupy or before Occupy, and this you could have written the same story actually even when I arrived in China in 2002. People were saying that about the South China Morning Post, that it was being neutered, and I think you're seeing this as sort of a straight line, or maybe not a straight line trend, a worsening trend now as China asserts even more control over Hong Kong.
And I wanted to add that I think the reasons for purchasing the South China Morning Post were to counter a so-called negative Western perception. So it plays right into the themes of our report tonight. We're going to take two more questions. So we'll go here in the middle and here up front. And we'll start with the middle. Thank you.
Hi, this is Vivian from Columbia Journalism School, and I actually followed one of the assistant reporter of New York Times. His name is Edward Wong, and once I read a tweet on his Twitter, he said you want to catch up with a local resource in Beijing, and after the local lady, Chinese lady, no, he is a Chinese guy working for New York Times, so he was scolded as the running dog for the United States. So apparently he feels really frustrated. So I'm wondering, how did the ordinary Chinese people view the foreign news outlets? So this is the very first question. Second is a very pragmatic question, which kind of VPN do you think is the most stable? I really want to know. Thank you.
Okay. One very practical question. Yeah.
My name is Ian Pan, and I'm also a student at Columbia University. So my question is very simple. So we talk a lot about social media and digital technology. And I think all of us know there's a trend of the rise of the middle class in Chinese society. And the gentleman previously talked about a lot of Chinese students studying abroad and going back. So I would like to know, combining all those factors, do you anticipate any change, perhaps in 10 years from now? Is the situation getting better or worse?
That's fantastic. So the first question was neo-Maoist rhetoric directed at foreign news organizations and reporters, and that is also falls into the threats and intimidation category.
Well, I think that actually speaks to, I think the biggest concern about the stepped up pressure on foreign journalists is just the impact it has on Chinese employees of foreign news organizations and also Chinese sources. Basically, those are the people who are really under threat. You don't see any foreign journalists in jail, but the risk of intimidation or jail is much more real for the Chinese people, whether they're working directly for news organizations, which I think that's much more rare that you'll see a real action taken. It does happen occasionally, but also much more serious problem is for academics who might otherwise have been critical of the government. This is mentioned in the report. It's very hard to get those interviews now, and when they do give those interviews, when a Chinese source, even someone who's just a professor somewhere, is saying something kind of would seem innocuous, a lot of pressure can be put on them for giving those kinds of interviews, and that is a change that's pretty dramatic from when I first got.
Yeah, I would add to that. I wanted to mention the impact on sources, because I found over recent years, I've been out for about 2 years. I went back to China for a year, but I report a lot in minority areas, in the Tibetan areas, and in Xinjiang. And the level of fear I found among sort of ordinary people is really kind of like North Korea level, where I used to report, and it's just kind of each year seems worse and worse, and where people even saying fairly innocuous things are really scared to talk to us. And just it doesn't really matter what they say, just the mere fact that they're speaking to us. And we're running short of time, but I mean, I can tell you lots of harrowing stories, but I'll be talking to somebody who's basically saying, nothing at all controversial. And, then they get into tremendous trouble just for talking. And, for ethnic minorities in China, it's kind of the same as for Han, but it's like everything is worse. They just have much less latitude.
Yeah, a young reporter here just beforehand, asked me about what my scariest experience in China was. And I don't really have any that are scary for my own personal safety, but I think any scary episodes I've had involve worrying that the source you talk to will get discovered or compromised. And you have to just take great care, even more care now, to avoid that happening. And
you started your question with a reference to one of the Times researchers, Owen Guo, and sort of framing it as people reacting to him. We had a longtime researcher in the room who worked with me, and she said she would be willing to make a few remarks to sort of represent the researcher's perspective on these issues. So I want to ask Mia Lee sort of just to speak to your question about how people view Western organizations, including the Chinese colleagues of ours who work for us.
Hi, my name is Mia Lee. I worked for the Times in Beijing at the Beijing Bureau from 2011 to early this year. So I think the government officials in China who are in charge of cracking down on foreign media, they are of a different mindset, because all they know is the media-government relationship in China, which is that the media is an arm of the government. So naturally, that's how they see all media. Even from the US, for example, they would assume that the New York Times is in China to push the agenda of the White House, and they would ask us, so they say, oh, what role does New York Times play in advancing Obama's agenda? Because they don't know that, I say, oh, the White House, we're basically enemies, and and they couldn't really understand that. So also because a lot of, for example, Xinhua then is they do a lot of intelligence gathering. So the Chinese government officials also a lot of times assume that the Times is here gathering information rather than representing the people's right to know, because in China the people don't really have the right to know. So wide with media represented people. So once you understand where they're coming from, so they usually just ask us, what are you doing? What are you reporting on? I would just try to be very open because we're just doing our job, so we have nothing to hide. So I just said, if you want to know what we're working on, follow us on Twitter. As for me, I just try to stick to my job, and there is nothing that I do for my job that's outside, that's required for just day-to-day reporting, really. And that's basically my approach to it, and I survived.
You have just left our bureau recently, it's now living in New York.
Should we know that she had a previous distinguished stint in
Yeah.
Forbes?
I think we have found just the right note to end our session on today. We've talked about a lot of reasons for pessimism and concern about the free press, about foreign reporters, about sources, about news assistants in China and Hong Kong. But I think I would want everyone to leave here today with the feeling that it's very much worth reporting on China. It's very much bringing that story to the world. And one real reason for optimism is that there are so many ordinary Chinese people who have that dream, that aspiration to tell a story. So thank you for joining us today, everyone.